Welcome, everyone. My name is Shirley, and I will be your moderator this evening. I am excited to welcome Stefan Wells and Matthew Donato, consultants with Cirrus Consulting Group, as our speakers this evening for their insight on 3 critical clauses to protect the future of your practice. If you have any questions this evening, please type it out in the Q&A section, and we will answer questions live at the end of the webinar. Stefan and Matthew, welcome, and thank you for being with us tonight. I will pass it over to you now.
Thank you, Shirley.
Well, thank you everybody for attending. As mentioned, this is Stefan. My name is Matthew. We very much look forward to hosting today's course with all of you on the 3 critical lease clauses. To start everything off, we're just going to start with a quick entry poll for everybody. This will just help give Stefan and myself a good understanding of the room, right? Who we're speaking to. Can we cater some of the content to specific expectations or requirements? So we'll just pull that up now for everybody. And if you wouldn't mind just taking a quick moment here just to fill out, that would be greatly appreciated. Like I said, it just helps us cater some of the content for this evening's webinar. And we'll just give you about 45 seconds or so here before we close that down. And we'll get started with the remainder of the presentation.
Well, thank you again, everybody, for showing up this evening. Again, my name's Stefan. I'm one of the senior consultants here at Cirrus Consulting. The purpose of today's webinar is to do a deeper dive into some of the legal provisions within the lease and how to avoid $100,000 mistakes through 3 specific clauses: the relocation, the assignment, and the option to renew clause. Now, tonight, I'm going to give you guys a brief market update on some key states, as well as go over how to protect your estate and your family. And we'll talk about some of the common mistakes when approaching a lease negotiation. First off, I think it's important for you all to understand a little bit about who we are here at Cirrus and how we've been representing the dental community for over 25 years now. First and foremost, Cirrus is a healthcare and dental specialized tenant representation firm. We've been in business nearly for 30 years now, and we're actually founded by doctors for doctors. So we're the only firm in North America who exclusively specialize in dental office lease negotiations. And to date, we've completed over 13,000 lease negotiations. So really, we help doctors in all aspects of leases, whether it's a renewal, a new start, or even doctors down the road who are looking at transitioning. We really focus on ensuring that the lease agreement's going to be properly structured, have favorable financial terms, beneficial legal terms, but most importantly, limited liabilities and exposures to you as the doctors. Now, what makes us a bit more unique from your typical brokerage or law firm is that we actually do everything in-house. So we've got a lease negotiation team comprised of real estate attorneys on staff who are specifically experienced in representing doctors and dentists. We've also got some former real estate brokers, many of which we like to joke we brought over from the dark side or the landlord side. So they really intimately understand that landlord's thought process. When going into negotiations, they're speaking the exact same language as your landlord. Importantly as well, we've got an analytics team, which consists of some paralegals and real estate data management professionals. So we've got access to all the same proprietary real estate data as all the big brokerages do. So when going into negotiations, we've got an immense amount of data to back us up, what market rent looks like in any given area, and even so far as to what rent projections are going to be like for the next 5, 10, 15 years. Finally, there's the consulting team with Matthew and I are a part of, and we're involved in advising our clients about their lease situation and creating that specific negotiation treatment plan for them. And now we do also do lectures across the nation, many of the major convention centers we've been at, so Pacific, Greater New York, California Dental Association, really we're coast to coast throughout the nation. Now, we do have a bit of a disclaimer before we go into some of the market updates. There's no guarantees or any sort of future predictions in terms of the statements we're going to go read to you today. Again, our crystal ball is as good as yours at the end of the day. Matthew, I'll leave the floor for you for the market updates. You're muted there, Matthew.
Yes, certainly. So as Stefan mentioned, the reason that we do that is obviously we have a great resource as Stefan was going through in regards to how we can project the data, how we can look forward and do all of these analytical components through the negotiations of rents and otherwise. But really what we want to look at here is how has the market changed? Where are your market rates today? And what does all of that look like? Right. So as you can see here, looking at, we'll start with the national and we'll move into Chicago, and then we have a few others as well. But if we're looking at the national averages overall, looking here, we can see, as most of us experienced through 2020, 2021, there was a dip in market rates, right? And that had to do with the increase in the vacancy rates. The spaces were becoming more vacant. There were a lot more people moving, defaulting on their leases and otherwise, right? But now, as we're seeing right now, is that we're on trajectory. We're matching that inflationary period that we're all going through, and we're seeing that is going to be on the rise, right? It is very similar here in Chicago, right? It matches fairly closely to the national averages as in the curves. Now, if we look at the LA market, for example, this is one of those metropolitan areas that through the experience, they were in a scenario where the rental rates did come down, but not quite as much, but still going for that increase. Same here in Nashville, right? Now, one of the components that needs to be thought of is, we all know the scenario that we're in with the economic climate, right? We are looking at the highest inflation rate we've ever seen to date. And by all intents and purposes, we are in what would technically, by definition, refer to a recessionary period. Now, what that means is that we're looking at entering a market with a high degree of volatility, right? And as we're looking at a volatile market, what do you expect the landlord to do in the future when the market becomes more volatile? And typically that means that the landlords are looking at trying to find and recoup their investments down the road and ensure that they're getting that revenue that they are expecting. But how do you lock yourself in before that happens? Right. So for any of you that are looking at renewing your leases or looking at starting your first practices, or maybe we're looking at expanding, right? How do we utilize the leverage of the current market and get in at a sure rate rather than getting in at a later time or allowing ourselves to fall victim to an inflationary time frame? If you could just go to the next slide there for me, Stefan. So if we look at Seattle, once again, you can see through the major metropolitan areas, the time frames here and the effects that were had on the rental rates are fairly identical. But what you can see here in Seattle, the increase is quite steep, whereas in Boston, we're looking at more of a plateau. Now, that does have to do with some development, that has to do with vacancy rates, that there is more space available in those markets where the demand is going to be met to a higher degree, and therefore the rental rates don't have to be increased to such a high degree. Now, for those that are interested and you want to take a deep dive into what your specific submarket, never mind the overall metropolitan area, but for your specific property and your specific submarket, we have the ability to utilize our proprietary data to analyze your property, analyze your submarket, overall market, and even buildings that are just comparable to that you're in today, to give you a much better picture as to how your rental rate compares today to what the market is doing and how to best negotiate those rental rates as you look forward through the next 5, 10, 15 years, right? And what are those effects going to be over the long run? Some basic demographic data as well. You name it, we can help you source all of that. But very important that when you're evaluating your renewals, when you're evaluating anything that has to do with your lease, you're paying close attention to those financials just as much as the three major clauses that Stefan is going to be going through today as well.
So at the end of the day, what are we here to talk about? And that's a lease. So what is a lease at the end of the day? It's one of the questions we come across at a lot of our seminars and webinars that we've been doing over the last couple of years. And really, at the end of the day, what a lease is it's a check. Oops. It's one of the biggest checks that you're going to write in your professional and working life, maybe aside from a residential property. It really is a check you're signing if you've got a 2,000 square foot space and you're paying $5,000 a month in rent. The average dentist is going to stay in their space statistically on average over 22 years. Now, even if we look at just that, we don't look at any rent escalations, any inflation, or any additional expenses on top of that. Just taking that gross payment of $5,000 a month, that's $60,000 per year and over 600,000 over 10 years. If we're looking at over a 20-year period, the length of your tenancy, that's over $1.2 million. So if anything that I want to get across through the presentation tonight is that how important the lease is to your business and your practice, and two, how important you as a dental tenant are, and how valuable you become to the landlord. Now, through our negotiations through a lease, there's really 7 financial negotiables. Every aspect of the lease is negotiable, and we're going to give you some tips and tricks today to help you better position for now and for the future of your practice. So in terms of the financial negotiables in your lease, again, just from a high level perspective, we have 7 different variables that can actually affect the financial negotiations of your lease. So you've got the base rent, annual increases. Like I said, at the moment, we're seeing an inflation go through the roof, and some of these leases that may have been in line with inflation over the last 20, 30 years, maybe have only gone up 2 to 3% year over year. Now we're starting to see a little bit more of effect on those increases. So there's certain things that we can do to either fix the rent for a period of time or even actually cap those annual increases. We also talk about common area maintenance, the additional expenses you're paying on top of that base rent. Now, a majority of leases nowadays are going to be a triple net lease, whereby the landlord will charge you a base rent plus any additional expenses on top of that for tax, maintenance, or insurance. Now, depending on if you're building out a practice from scratch, there's a fixturing period as well. Now, you're going to want to make sure that you've got some free rent during that fixturing period before commencement. Is there any tenant improvement allowance, and what sort of landlord work is the landlord willing to provide to do as well before you build out? But we want to make sure that the landlord has some skin in the game as well during those initial stages of a build out or starting of a practice. Now, some critical clauses that we're going to want to go over within the lease. First and foremost is going to be the relocation clause. So we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into some of these critical clauses within your lease. There usually are about 20 to 25 provisions. Some are a bit higher priority items than others. But from our experiences, majority of dentists will do is, they look at what they're paying for in the lease, how long they're paying for it. And then after that, they read that first page, and from there on, they put the rest of the 30 pages in a drawer and essentially forget about it. And then they'll look at it again in 5 or 10 years' time when the lease comes to expiry or they're trying to sell the practice and discover that something as simple as a single sentence has put the future of their practice or sale at risk. So we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into those 3 critical clauses that have a real detrimental effect on your practice's future. So first clause there we're going to look at is the relocation clause. Now, a relocation clause really is essentially an option granted to the landlord to change the location of a tenant's premises upon landlord's provision of a notification. So one of the things we want to do in these cases, if there is a relocation clause, is primarily remove the relocation clause in its entirety. Now, if for whatever reason, that's not possible, it doesn't necessarily mean that you still can't greatly mitigate the overall expense or risk that you would have been exposed to otherwise. Now, in some select cases, if it is written properly or correctly, the landlord is still responsible for some of the associated costs that are going to come with it in improving or relocating the space. Now, what's important in that sense is to determine exactly what that means, what level of downtime you're going to have for your practice, and what exactly the landlord is covering through those costs. So this is actually a sample of some of the language that we often see in these circumstances. So this is basically a provision that we see that's common in a relocation clause. We're just going to go through to give you some idea of some of the red flags that you have to be wary of. As it dictates in this case, the landlord has with as little as 60 days notice. If you were given a letter, now imagine from the landlord saying you had 60 days notice that you're going to be shut down, your business is going to be closed, and you're going to have to relocate from your premises. Imagine what that's going to do for your bottom line, or what kind of a patient attrition you would face. Now if any of you have moved or built out a dental practice, relocating within 60 days is certainly not enough time to make a reasonable move to another space within the premises. It still talks about reasonably comparable size. Not only can you be relocated, but you may be put in a space that's frankly worse than you would have otherwise been in currently. So you may have had a first floor office to begin with, but now you're on a third floor, fourth floor. Maybe you're in the corner. Maybe you don't have great access. There could be a number of changes that overall are putting you in a much worse position. That 60 days notice alone is a massive red flag. If we look at here, section B, it says the premises are relocated, the lease will remain unchanged, except that the rent will be adjusted based off of the gross leasable area of the new premises. So not only can they relocate you, they can adjust the rents accordingly as well. So you could end up in a bigger space than you would have otherwise been in, and now not only have you been relocated, now you're paying more rent on top of that. So there are a number of things here the landlord will reimburse for the tenant, such as reasonable expenses. However, what does that truly mean? What exactly is it meant by a reasonable expense? Are they going to cover the cost of equipment? Would you even want the landlord to handle your equipment? That costs hundreds of thousands of dollars. Are they going to cover the cost of getting a Schein technician to come in and reconnect all your equipment? A final paragraph at the end here says, notwithstanding the provisions here to be construed broadly in favor of the landlord, the tenant objects to the relocation of the new premises. So the landlord may actually elect to terminate your lease on 30 days written notice. So not only have that relocation clause in your lease, in whatever notice period you might have, if you now object to that relocation, they can actually terminate or cancel your lease outright. So if you want to put somebody, they want to put somebody into your space that at the end of the day wants to pay more rent, they have that relocation clause at their disposal. What effect is that now going to have for your business and your bottom line? So what ultimately is the cost of this mistake? What's the cost of having this in your lease? Now, having to build out a new unit, the cost of practice downtime, reduction in the appraised value. I mean, ultimately, this could cost you upwards of, $300,000 or $400,000. Now we're probably seeing, with the way build out costs are for practices, upwards of $500,000. Now, there are a number of step downs. There are a number of things that we've been successful in negotiating. The best case scenario is always to remove the relocation clause completely. But if we're ever unable to remove it, then we want to at least extend some of the notice period, because 60 days just truly is not enough time for you to be able to find yourself in a new space. Ideally, you'd want to have the new space, if you're being moved, up and ready and running before you have to close your own doors, so that there's no downtime, there's no patient attrition. Now, the second provision I want to touch on tonight is going to be the assignment clause. Now, the assignment clause essentially governs what level of control the landlord's going to have over your ability to assign your lease or essentially sell your practice at the end of the day. Now, the actual definition here is to transfer to another party of all of the tenant's interests in a lease for the remainder of the lease term. Now, this is an extremely important provision, especially when you're planning for an eventual transition or practice sale. As well, we'll look into some of the assignment clause a little deeper. When this is structured correctly, then it's going to allow for a much smoother and clean transaction from one practitioner to another, and at the end of the day, limit or remove any sort of continuing liability you might have through this clause. So here's a sample of an assignment clause, and it's really found in 75%, and really at dare saying probably 90% of the leases Matthew and I review on a daily basis. So this first section here says if the tenant would wish to assign or sublet the premises, it shall first have received the consent of the landlord. Now, this is very common. That in itself is not the issue. I'm sure if you were the landlord, you want some level of say on who's going to come in or out of the building. Now, what we don't want to happen is the landlord to place any level of undue control or place any stipulations on what you or an incoming buyer need to meet in order for them to provide that consent. Can it be delayed? Can it be unreasonably withheld? What are the restrictions or the conditions that are going to be put on your lease? Now, the first thing you can see here is if you've requested permission to transfer the lease, and in this lease, it says the landlord shall, one, either approve your request and to assign the lease. They can simply decline your request, or three, they can actually terminate the lease agreement upon the effective date of such proposed lease assignment or sublet. So what does this mean? Right there, just from you asking for permission and the landlord declines, this is what we call a termination provision. So just from asking permission, the landlord can actually say, well, nope, and cancel the lease agreement right there. So suddenly your practice, which you spent 20, 30 years in the foundation of this location building, putting your blood, sweat, and tears for, now you don't have a lease to operate that space anymore. Sure, you may be able to sell some of the goodwill and equipment, but that termination of the lease is going to have a massive effect on the value of your practice when you go to sell. If you can't sell the actual space, what are you really selling at the end of the day? Now, if you see here in the next section, it says landlord shall have the right to revise the minimum rent to be paid during the remainder of the term, the greater of the current market rent, or for the lease premises, 15% greater than the current rent. So you can ask for that permission again to transfer the lease, and the landlord can say or have that exact sort of excuse that, oh, I'm going to raise the rent. So Matthew and I actually had a doctor in Colorado. It was a husband and wife duo. They were selling their practice in Colorado, and they were actually moving across the country to Pennsylvania to join their father-in-law and starting a new practice there. And as a condition for sale, the landlord was actually going to raise rent for the incoming buyer by over 25%. Just imagine this, guys. This family had already sold their house, packed everything up. Selling the practice was that final to-do thing, that checklist for their to-do list. And the landlord is throwing this kind of obstacle in front of them. It's these things we need to be wary of and having that kind of undue control from the landlord. Now, furthermore, this lease sample goes on to say, should the tenant receive any form of rental income, cash, goods, or any form of consideration in connection with the assignment, then over and above the current base rental rates payable to the landlord, and only during any fiscal year, the difference between the annual rent and any such income or other consideration shall be paid directly to the landlord. Now, a lot of leases that are written today, they're not written keeping a dental tenant in mind. Very generic. And here's what we refer to as consideration language or proceeds of sale. Pardon me. So whereas the landlord, as a condition similar to raising that rent, can actually demand a portion of the proceeds of the sale of your practice. So we had a doctor not too far from our office here who had this exact language in their lease. As a condition for sale, the landlord was demanding 25% of the proceeds of the sale of their practice. And unfortunately, this doctor had their hands tied, and in order to sell the practice, they had to cut a check to the landlord for over $263,000. Now, just imagine what that would do to your retirement fund if that large a chunk of your hard-earned return on investment is just lost to the landlord's hands. Now, notwithstanding that, the landlord's consent to a single sublet or an assignee, the tenant shall not be released from any of its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its societies or subtenants to observe each and every covenant of the lease. Now, let's say you were able to meet all the criteria the landlord requires within that lease. So this continuing liability would actually keep you obligated for all the provisions in the lease even after sale. So what does that mean? So let's say you have a buyer that was to default or go bankrupt after you've sold them the practice. With this kind of language in your lease, the landlord could actually come after you for any of those defaults or damages. Now, I can almost guarantee you right now, majority of the people on this webinar, you guys have that clause within your lease. We see it time and time again. It just often gets overlooked by either a broker or an attorney. Now, we've seen the nightmares that happen, frankly. Matthew and I had a client, they were in Michigan. Now, this doctor was selling their practice. They were able to meet all the other criteria that the landlord had put on to them in order to provide consent. Thought he had wiped his hands clean, moved down to Florida, enjoyed life on the beach. And unfortunately, 3 years later, he gets a call from the landlord saying, hey, sorry to be the bearer of bad news. The guy you sold the practice to is actually defaulted on the lease. I need you to come back up here, pay for the last 3 months of rent. So he was out over $20,000 there, and pay for the continuation of the term until you find a new buyer. So again, he had to fly back up all the way from Florida, pay for the last 3 months of rent, pay for the continuation of the term until he got a new buyer. So at the end of the day, he was out over $80,000 out of pocket because he was continually tied to the lease, even after sale. The last thing that dentist wanted was to come back and practice again. He let go of his license. It's a nightmare situation to deal with when you think you're done, with your practice or the dental world. Now, at the end of the day, what we want to ensure is that as long as you're bringing an accredited dentist to the landlord, that they're providing their consent and that it's as smooth a process as possible for you. So best case scenario, you should be removed from any future liability. Now, in some cases, you may have to provide, 1 or 2 years continuing liability, but what you don't want to do is provide that continuing liability forever on end. Now, as you can see, a single provision could make or break your return on investment when you do go to sale. So what is the cost of this mistake of having an assignment in your lease? The inability to sell your practice, having to absorb significant increase in rent, and, remaining liable as a guarantor beyond the practice sale, paying a portion of the actual proceeds from your hard-earned investment and sale. This could open you up to liability anywhere between 200 upwards of $750,000 worth of damages and liability. Again, what we want to ensure is that the landlord isn't sticking his hand in the cookie jar or taking what's yours, or is that boogeyman that's looking over your shoulder that could come after you at any moment. Once you've sold the practice, let's ensure you can enjoy your retirement and rest easy knowing that everything's secure. Now, the last provision I want to talk about is the option to renew clause. Again, just to define the option to renew clause, it's a lease provision that gives the commercial tenant the right to renew the current lease for additional terms, subject to the clause and conditions as set out in the lease. Now, again, we always recommend having that sort of runway, whether it's in term or in options. It's important to have that peace of mind and security at the end of the day, knowing that you have a certain amount of runway and term left, at least to give yourself the option if you're backed up against a corner. Now, some mistakes that we often see dentists make is that the lease will be coming up for expiry, let's say when they're near their end of their career, when they're 65, and they think that I'm just going to sign the lease or I'll sell the practice then without any issues. Now, I don't want, what they're often concerned is that they don't want to commit any long or commit to a longer term because they're going to sell the practice. So, now often I have doctors worry about being 65 and signing a 10 or 20-year lease. But if you're in a good location, if you have a good demographic, you're in a good high net worth practice that you're confident you're going to be able to sell. As long as the lease is structured properly, which we'll talk about in some of that assignment language, there's nothing wrong with having the additional term going forward. So let's start with looking at a option to renew language that's found in majority of the leases that we deal with. So here it says, provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain the tenant, and if the tenant duly has regularly paid its rent and performed its covenant and obligation under the lease and has not been in default. So the first thing that we can see here is provided that Dr. Joe Black shall remain as the tenant. Now, what I've seen in a number of cases where savvy landlords, what they'll do is and say is, hey, I'm giving these options to you, the tenant, Dr. Black. They're not to, these are personal to you. They're not transferable. They're not for any future buyer. So, I was speaking to a doctor recently. They were looking to sell their practice, and he told me, "Oh, I've got 12 years of term remaining." And when I actually got a copy of his lease, what it turned out was that he actually had only 2 years remaining. Of the 5-year option, he had 2 5-year options rather after that, but those options were personal to him and they were non-transferable. So the landlord will say in these instances, hey, I gave those options to you. I didn't give them to any future buyer. And again, this is just some of the tactics that a landlord will use to give themselves leverage going into negotiation. What they're going to say is, hey, any new buyer wants additional or wants those terms or options. What they're going to have to do is pay me a higher rent or whatever else I want in order for them to get those options. So it's important to understand and to have those options that can be transferable as well in the future. It's important to be aware of your option to renew deadline. You're going to have a time period, normally around 6 to 9 months prior to the end of the term, where you'll have to give notice. If you don't give notice, those options actually become null and void. And a lot of times what happens is that the landlord won't tell you when those critical dates are being applied. As you can see here, it says, any such renewal shall be on the landlord's then current standard form lease. So if we've, say, negotiated or if we've made some changes to the lease, which I've seen on a number of cases where we've represented the client, we've made some amendments to the lease, they, for whatever reason, then exercise their option in the future as is, and the landlords then just put them back on their standard form lease and inserted, in some cases, a demolition clause or whatever they wanted to do, just purely because the renewal language saying that they could go back on the landlord's current form lease. Now, this is one is really in favor of the landlords. In no event shall the rent be less than the rent paid in the last year of the original term. And as said earlier, very unlikely that the landlord ever wants you to pay less than what you've been paying in the original term. We have to be very wary of how future rental escalations are being calculated. Is it based off fair market value, or are we now being tied to CPI or the rate of inflation? If there is significant dip in the market in the future, we want to see some of those benefits. We want to be able to capitalize on that going into renewal. However, what we see the landlords can easily just say is that rents are to be no lower than the previous year. And the last sentence of this paragraph says, if the landlord and tenant are unable to agree on market rent within 60 days of the exercise for the tenant of its option to renew, that the tenant shall be determined by arbitration based off of market rents for renewing tenants in the building. So now there may be tenants like Walmart or Starbucks. They may be big tenants that have renewed in the building and that they're paying a lot more rent than you're currently paying, and shouldn't be compared to those renewing tenants in the building. Again, another provision that's just common in really 90% of the leases, often is overlooked, and something as simple as this can really be a detriment to your bottom line. And if rents are starting to get away from you because of inflation, you could be hurting down the road, and that could really affect your eventual practice sale. So again, what is the cost now, or this mistake? What's the cost of having an improperly structured option to renew clause? So you can see here there are 4 or 5 red flags that can have a huge cost and liability to your practice, where you're looking at upwards of $200,000 to $500,000 worth of liability if this isn't done correctly. And you can have to relocate unexpectedly because you missed your option at the end of the term, inability to sell the practice if you don't have existing term even on there. Majority of buyers are going to need to lease see 10 to 12 years of existing term when it comes to buying your practice. The banks are going to need to see that in order to provide a buyer a loan. That's what they need to say, hey, if you're going to in the space, I know you're going to be there at least for 10 to 12 years. So it's in line with the amortization rate for that loan. Now, this is an actual copy of a letter that we were privy to that a landlord actually wrote to a client. So basically just pointing out when they've missed their option to renew, that they were required to give written notice of their intention to renew, not later than 6 months. So you were required to do this no later by this date. Please be advised, we'll be placing a for lease sign on the premises. We're only going to show the prospective tenants during business hours, and they'll attempt to contact your office. So this was a landlord, a quote unquote, very friendly landlord that waited for the tenant to miss that option, was sent the notice saying, hey, we're placing a for lease sign. So you're suddenly seeing patients and there's a for lease sign outside your space. Now, how do you think that's going to go across for your current patients that are coming to see you? And a lot of questions are going to be asked to start showing the space around the potential tenants. So really, those are just 3 single clauses that can open you up to hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of liability. There's a long list here of things that we didn't touch on, and in the interest of time, any one of these provisions could mean or make or break your sale, could mean the difference between you having a practice and essentially being kicked on the curb. We touched on assign, we touched on the relocation and option language, But there are other, death and disability clauses, and, insurance claims and otherwise that are going to be important to know whether they're in your lease or not. There's lots of languages, again, in the lease that can really have a real detrimental effect on your lease. And many of those are hidden or phrased in such a way that are going to be hard to understand. You really aren't going to know they're there until, experts such as ourselves are able to point them out for you. So this next slide is a slide we've actually pulled from one of our lease negotiators who actually used to work on the landlord side. So this is the tenant lease cycle. Now, what we are recommending is that you always start that lease negotiation process anywhere between 18 to 24 months before you're expired. This is in order to essentially maximize your leverage. Lots of people make the mistake to say, well, I've got an option to extend. I've got just have to give 6 months notice. I'll speak to the landlord in 6 months before, then I'll just, exercise my option as is. Now, there are a couple things wrong with that. First and foremost, depending on what the actual lease looks like, just exercising your option, you're essentially agreeing to not make any changes and you're keeping the same bad position or situation you were in otherwise. Now, the landlord may say, oh, we've got plenty of time, no problem. Let's talk about it next year. What they want to do, as you can see in the slide, is that they want to get you down to this 8 months or less period, get you closer to that expiry date, because realistically, you're less likelihood you're going to have enough time to leave or relocate if you don't like what's being offered to you. The likelihood is you're not going to be able to move, you're not going to be able to relocate the practice because that can take upwards of a year to complete. And even if you don't want to move, let's say you're adamant on staying, now you haven't had enough time. You've got your back against that lease expiry date, and you may be forced to accept whatever deal the landlord's going to put in front of you, which could put you in a far worse position than you initially started off with. So it's important just to know the critical dates when your lease expires, if there are any options. And again, these are things that we can monitor for our clients and make sure that they're well ahead of the time frame that they need to be aware of. Now, you're all probably thinking to yourself, with all these detrimental clauses and provisions, how can Cirrus even be successful in negotiating these, provisions over the last 25 years? So, we're very proud to be the preferred business solution partner for Henry Schein for over a decade now. Really, because they were looking for somebody who could look after their clients when it comes to the lease, because they know that a number of issues that their clients have had, whether it's being relocating, having a demolition clause in the lease, a number of other nightmares that could put the practice in jeopardy at the end of the day. So the reason we're successful is, first of all, what we do is we gather all the documentation, we get all the copies of the executed leases, any amending agreements, riders, exhibits, anything pertaining to the lease. Then we spend time just to understand and identify some of your career and practice goals. Where are you now? What are you trying to achieve? Where do you want to get in the future? If you're happy in the space, if you're at capacity, if you want to look at expansion, just to understand exactly where you are. We'll then review the office lease for any risks and liabilities. Like I said, we go through all the legal provisions, with a fine-tuned comb, and then we prepare market research. So we're going to pull up some of the proprietary data that we have access to, just to get a good understanding of the landlord. Is it a big REIT or institutional landlord? Is it a small mom and pop shop? And then from there, we develop a strategy for the negotiations. Now, do you notice through all those steps we've taken before approaching the landlord, we do a lot before we even talk to them. Now, one of the biggest mistakes we see, and I strongly suggest that even if you're thinking, oh man, I need to look at my lease, Do I have all these stuff, all these provisions within my lease? The last thing you should do, is, ring up your landlord and start asking questions. Can you take this out of my lease, or what does this mean in my lease? Candidly, that's a mistake. There's a reason that we do, a lot of these 5 steps before we even approach the landlord. It's so we have a good understanding of your view of the market, or of our view of the market, of your current location. And really, it's just about educating the landlord because, like we said, or like we've said, you're a good tenant. You pay your rent. You have some of the lowest default rates in the country. Why wouldn't a landlord want you? Why wouldn't they do their utmost to keep a tenant that stays in their space for over 20 years? Dentists, post-pandemic are quickly becoming more and more the anchor tenant for these landlords. So a lot of it is really just educating the landlord to explain, look, there's exactly why you're a star tenant for them to have. There's certain provisions within the lease that we would want to address, but just to protect the future of your practice. That being said, we're paid directly by our clients. We're not asking the landlord for any kind of commission or anything. And majority of the time, the landlords are actually very happy to work with us because of that. We appreciate that, we've still got to work with the landlord at the end of the day. We're not trying to ruin any relationships. We understand that's important in order for your business to flourish. The landlord doesn't always want to directly deal with the client. There's a very different dynamic as opposed to dealing with a firm such as ours. Typically the way we approach the landlord was we would normally spend 20 to 25 hours just negotiating the financials of the lease. And from our experience, once we have a motivated landlord on the financials, because really what they're looking for is who's my tenant, how long are they going to be in this space? How long are they staying there? And how much are they going to be paying me? And once they've ticked those number of boxes, they're going to be much more motivated to make some of those changes to the legal provisions of the lease, which at the end of the day have little bearing on their bottom line, but have a huge effect on the value of your business. So from there, we would review the final executed documents for your benefit, just to make sure everything's in order. Because what we've seen happen time and time again is that landlords try to make some final changes, or they try to sneak in clauses under everyone's nose before the final signing of the lease document. So before you even sign that dotted line, we ensure that there's a final pass through of that lease to ensure everything's in line with what we previously negotiated, and you're not making a mistake on that final signature. Now, this is just one of our latest Google reviews. This was from a doc who literally the landlord and the lease just prevented them from selling the practice 3 times at the age of 74. Landlord was, because of the landlord, they were forced to relocate the practice. Again, 74 years of age. They tried to sell 3 times. The landlord would find a way or otherwise to say no or scare buyers away. So in the end of the day, through the process, we realized relocation was what was going to make the most sense for them. We helped them relocate the practice, got a much better space, and the landlord was so desperate for a medical dental tenant that they were willing to cover upwards of 100% of those build-out costs for the doctor. So ultimately, because of this, the client was able to secure a longer-term lease, which they were eventually able to sell. So at this time, guys, we've got over 300 5-star Google reviews. Now, as sort of a courtesy to you guys provided through Henry Schein, you are being offered what's called a critical dates in risk analysis. Now, typically this is valued at around a $2,000 value, but again, through your registration and attendance today, Henry Schein is covering that cost. We're able to offer this to you on a complimentary basis. So through this critical analysis, we spend a few hours reviewing your lease for any of the traps or the red flags that we discussed today, such as relocation assignment. We'll pull market data as well to ensure that you're in line with rents, see what those rent projections are looking like for you, and overall sit down with you, create a strategy on how we need to approach the landlord through the negotiations, and then at the end of the day, what our involvement can look like through that process and next steps from there. Perfect. So I think, Matthew, there should be an exit poll. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. So as Stefan mentioned, for everybody in attendance this evening, as a courtesy and a thank you, we will be offering the complimentary lease consultation. So we're just going to pull up a quick poll here. If you are interested, please feel free to say yes. Just give us a little bit more additional detail there, just so we can help prepare for some of our initial calls, right? And I'll give everybody a couple moments here to go through. And then, of course, if you do have any specific questions for in regards to your lease agreement, in regards to the market data, what have you, both Stefan and my contact details are on the screen here. You can feel free to give us a call or shoot us an email, whatever works best for yourselves. I saw a couple familiar names in the attendee list as well. So, like I said, feel free to reach out to us. But now we're just going to open up the floor to some questions. So if anybody does have any questions regarding the content that we covered, feel free to utilize the Q&A or the chat function. And Stefan and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions that may be pertinent to your situation. So I do have a question here, Stefan, that have it field. But so this doctor here has mentioned that they are actually under 1 year from their expiration of the lease.
Okay.
Now they're concerned that based off the sort of 18 to 24 month window that they may be too late in negotiating.
No, so certainly, we always suggest that 18 to 24 months, but it's never too late to engage. If you've got a year, that's still a reasonable amount of time for us to now engage with the landlord and ensure we're getting understanding of their point of view. We want to understand, is there a looming redevelopment on the horizon? What are the needs of the landlord? So if you've only got a year left, now's the time to strike the iron while it's hot and really get that process started, because you don't want to have analysis paralysis, as it were, and keep putting that off thinking, oh, what if, or I'll wait to see how the market changes. And now you're left with just a couple of months before your option to renew language, and you have your back against the wall. The more time you have, not only to make more sound decisions, but also, again, have a better outcome from that negotiation. Really, time equals leverage in these situations. The more time you have, the better it's going to be for you at the end of the day.
Okay. Yeah, and one of the other doctors here just mentioned that they're in a similar situation, about 8 months from the termination of the lease. So, doctor, that is a very similar response there to what Stefan just mentioned. Right, we don't want to lock ourselves into that analysis paralysis, as it were. It's a perfect example that that Stefan mentioned there. Is we just want to make sure that we are preparing ourselves, whether just because you leave it a little bit later. Obviously, ideally we would love to have that 24-month window, but just because you've left it a little later doesn't mean that you've lost your leverage. We can still make those changes, we can still go through it. Obviously there's just a higher degree of urgency, but definitely, doctor, I would suggest reaching out to Stefan, and he can speak about that a bit further with you as well. There's another doctor here that very similar situation as well, needing to accept the option writing by May 1. Yes, doctor, please send that through via email to either myself or Stefan. You can see that there, info@cirrusconsultinggroup.com. If you just want to send that through, Stefan and myself, we can take a look at it and we can speak further about that.
Yeah, certainly before, pulling the trigger there and sending an acceptance of that option to your landlord, as we mentioned, there could be a slew of these kind of provisions within your lease. Have a professional review that, such as us, make sure you're in the best position possible before you commit yourself for another 5, 10 years to a lease that could be a ticking time bomb when you do go to sell the practice.
Yeah, and then there was just a follow-up to that as well, Stefan, as we're going through live. But he mentioned that he has a meeting with them tomorrow to discuss a new lease. Should we just gather some information from them? Certainly, doctor. I would definitely want to gather some more information from the landlord, get sort of a feeling of their expectations as to what they're looking at in regards to a new lease. I'm not sure what time that is, but what I would advise is prior to having that conversation, uh, if you're available beforehand, of course, have a conversation with Stefan or myself, and we can go through that with you and some of the questions to ask the landlord at that point in time without necessarily showing the hand, for lack of a better term. Perfect. So 4 p.m. EST, absolutely. Give Stefan or myself a call. We'll be more than happy to discuss. And then the other here, the terms of the lease have already been set, but I was hoping to renegotiate. Doctor, I would say we can take this in further detail tomorrow if you are available as well. Uh, just in regards to that, things may be set in stone, but we can certainly talk about that. See that you have a meeting, you have a set up meeting already for Thursday. Is it possible to move the time to 11? I can certainly look into that for you, doctor, with Stefan, and we can set something up there. I'll just make a note of that here as well. And then we can send you an email confirmation of that. Perfect. Excellent. So I certainly appreciate all of the questions there. Another doctor here, Stefan, just the last one to finish up. That's looking at selling the practice in the next 3 to 5 years, and similarly was concerned about the options. Only has one 5-year option remaining on the lease. So what would be your advice there?
Yeah, certainly. So if you're looking at selling the practice and that's imminently on the horizon and you only have that 1 year 5 option, definitely important to engage in that renegotiation. Because as we mentioned, if you've only got 1 year 5 option, it's going to be very difficult for you to find or assume a buyer because they're going to need to have that 10 to 12 years in order to get financing. Beyond just the term, it's very important we take a look at that assignment language to make sure that you're not going to be stuck on the lease forever, even after sale, that the landlord, again, isn't trying to get any money or make that process as difficult as possible for you. So certainly happy to review your lease and walk through that process a little in greater depth for you, Doctor.
Excellent. Well, perfect. I think that concludes all the questions. Like I said earlier, I know that typically when we walk away from the webinar and we have time to let it sit and some other components resonate, feel free to send Stefan or myself an email or give us a call. We're always more than happy to help. But thank you very much for having us, and thank you everybody for attending this evening.
Thank you so much, Stefan and Matthew, for a wonderful presentation this evening. And thank you all for joining us tonight. We did record tonight's webinar and will email the recording out sometime in the next week. We would appreciate your feedback via our survey that will pop up on your screen shortly. Thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in future webinars.